Hundreds of millions of honeybees have silently vanished from every corner of the planet. Without these pollinators, crops go unfertilized, and the stability of the world's food supply hangs in the balance. Even Australia, long regarded as an untouchable sanctuary, has now been breached. Yet this nation has proven tougher than anyone anticipated. Australians have transformed their own land into a real-world research station, racing to find a path forward alongside the most destructive bee parasite ever recorded. Their struggle has drawn the eyes of scientists and farmers across the globe. But what did it cost them to get here, and how does a nation convert total collapse into a reason for hope? That is what this documentary sets out to answer. For decades, honeybee colonies worldwide have been decimated by threats that arrive without warning and leave almost no trace. From the American Midwest to the fields of Western Europe and deep into Asia, beekeepers have watched generations of hives disappear at rates once considered unthinkable. In the United States, certain winters have eliminated close to 40% of all managed colonies, pushing the agricultural sector, particularly California's almond industry, to spend billions each year simply hiring bees to pollinate their crops. In China, some farming regions reached a point where workers were dispatched with small brushes to fertilize blossoms by hand. Across Europe, a devastating combination of neonicotinoid pesticides, a shifting climate, and the steady erasure of natural landscapes has progressively stripped fields of their pollinators. But the single most lethal force behind all of this remains the Varroa destructor mite. Once it enters a colony, that colony typically collapses within 1 to 2 seasons, leaving beekeepers with no choice but to apply synthetic chemical treatments just to slow the destruction. Against this grim global picture, Australia was treated as the final refuge. This was not mere good fortune. Australia's identity is a vast island continent, naturally isolated it from many of the invasive species plaguing the rest of the world. Layered on top of that natural advantage was one of the most uncompromising quarantine systems ever constructed. A traveler caught smuggling even a single jar of honey could face severe financial penalties. That fortress mentality worked. Before 2022, Australia maintained more than 530,000 commercial hives and exported hundreds of millions of Australian dollars worth of honey annually. Monica honey was spoken of as liquid gold on international markets, and Australian bee stock was considered the cleanest on Earth, completely untouched by Varroa. Countries around the world treated Australian bees as the benchmark. Then, the thing beekeepers had quietly dreaded for 50 years finally happened. In June 2022, the enemy arrived at Newcastle Port, the second busiest international seaport in New South Wales, processing up to 4,000 foreign vessels every year. Biosecurity officers checking sentinel hives near the docks found something that stopped them cold: tiny reddish parasites, each barely the size of a grain of sand, attached to the bees. Laboratory results confirmed what no one wanted to believe: Varroa destructor had entered Australia. The shock that followed rippled through the global beekeeping community instantly. For more than half a century, scientific literature had consistently described Australia as the world's last Varroa-free stronghold. The Australian press reached for the most dramatic comparison available, calling it the beekeeping industry's equivalent of September 11th, a rupture from which there would be no return to the world as it had been. The government's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a single day of the confirmed outbreak, New South Wales declared a biosecurity emergency and deployed more than 600 quarantine personnel and volunteers across the Hunter region. A hard red exclusion zone with a 10-kilometer radius was drawn around the outbreak site, wrapped in a purple surveillance ring extending a further 25 kilometers. Every possible pathway the mite could use to escape had to be identified and sealed off before further spread made that impossible. It was, by any measure, a full emergency mobilization across the entire state. All bee movement was halted. More than 300,000 commercial hives were locked in place overnight. Police checkpoints appeared on major highways, with officers stopping vehicles and opening hive boxes for direct inspection. CSIRO scientists and beekeeping associations launched coordinated testing across the region. Drones swept the skies over Newcastle. Specialized traps were placed throughout the city to intercept wild bees potentially carrying the parasite. The government activated emergency authority to order hive destruction on the spot, a power that hit small-scale beekeepers with particular force. Publicly, officials projected control. Behind closed doors, the fear was palpable. The New South Wales Minister for Agriculture framed the moment in historic terms. Australia had a genuine opportunity to do what no other country had ever managed: wipe out Varroa immediately after its first confirmed appearance. Every other affected nation, the United States, the countries of Europe, New Zealand, had tried and failed to achieve eradication. If Australia succeeded, it would stand alone in history. But to understand the intensity of that mission, one has to understand exactly what Varroa destructor does to a colony. Originally a parasite of Asian honeybees, the mite evolved over thousands of years alongside hosts that developed partial defenses against it. When it encounters the European honeybee, the species that drives virtually all commercial agriculture globally, the result is catastrophic. The mite measures less than 1 millimeter across, is reddish-brown, and practically invisible without magnification. Jessica May, a research director of the Department of Primary Industries, described the threat without softening it. A single mite on a single bee can carry multiple pathogens. The mite itself does not kill immediately. Instead, it degrades the colony steadily, week by week, until nothing remains. The mechanism is precise and brutal. The mite latches onto the bee's abdomen and drains the fat body, the organ that regulates immunity and energy reserves in the same way a liver does in mammals. As this feeding continues, the bee's immune system progressively fails. Infected bees emerge from development with malformed, crumpled wings that cannot support flight. They cannot forage, cannot contribute to the colony, and become a burden on an already weakened population. Meanwhile, the most dangerous phase of the mite's reproduction unfolds entirely out of sight. The female mite slips into brood cells immediately after eggs are deposited and reproduces inside the sealed wax chamber while larvae develop around her. From the outside, the colony can appear completely normal. Inside, the infestation multiplies silently through generation after generation. In tropical climates, a colony can be completely destroyed within one season. In cooler environments, the process takes 2 to 3 years, but the outcome is the same. This is the mechanism at the core of colony collapse disorder, the phenomenon responsible for eliminating up to 40% of managed colonies in the United States and Europe every single year for decades. In the weeks following Newcastle, the situation deteriorated faster than authorities had modeled. The surveillance perimeter was expanded from 25 kilometers to 50 kilometers. Then it stopped mattering how wide the zone was drawn. Within months, more than 260 confirmed outbreak sites had been recorded across New South Wales, from the northern coast all the way down towards the Victorian border. The mite was everywhere. Facing that reality, authorities turned to the same chemical weapons American and European beekeepers had used for decades. But even this option came freighted with danger. In the United States, Varroa had already developed resistance to at least 3 primary miticides within a decade of their introduction, forcing farmers to spend millions of dollars annually cycling through treatment rotations. In New South Wales, the decision was made to deploy fipronil in the highest-risk outbreak zones. Fipronil is extraordinarily toxic. Detectable at concentrations of just a few parts per billion, it kills aquatic invertebrates and can devastate non-target insect populations across entire ecosystems.
Ecologists warned that Australia's native pollinators, over 1,700 species, faced annihilation as unintended casualties. More than 14,000 hives were destroyed across a 4-month period. The financial and ecological damage was immense, and still the mite spread.
After 14 months of sustained effort and expenditure surpassing 100 million Australian dollars, the government reached a conclusion it had been resisting. The eradication campaign had failed. The reasons, laid out in sequence, were damning. Varroa is structurally impossible to detect at early infestation levels. It is sealed inside brood cells, invisible and protected, reproducing until populations are large enough to produce visible symptoms. By that point, dozens of surrounding colonies are already infected. Many of the hives processed in the early stages of the campaign were already compromised before a single inspector arrived. Human behavior made things worse. Beekeepers, facing the destruction of their entire livelihoods, moved hives out of quarantine zones before authorities reached them. Each unauthorized relocation gave Varroa an undetected ride across hundreds of kilometers of unaffected territory. Australia's geography itself was an obstacle no policy could overcome. With more than 530,000 commercial hives distributed across a continental landmass, plus an uncountable number of feral colonies living in natural cavities throughout the wilderness, absolute containment was never physically achievable. A single honeybee can travel 5 kilometers from its hive in a day. Wild colonies became mobile infection reservoirs entirely beyond the reach of any quarantine boundary. And time, the most finite resource in a containment effort, ran out. CSIRO scientists advised that once Varroa crossed into multiple states simultaneously, eradication at continental scale would become biologically impossible. That threshold was passed. In September 2023, the New South Wales government made it official. The eradication program was over. Jessica May of the Department of Primary Industries delivered the announcement with clinical directness. This mite is here and it is not going anywhere. We are no longer eradicating. It is about management now. It was a statement that changed everything. For the first time, Australia, the nation that had spent decades safeguarding its status as the world's last clean bee population, formally accepted that it would now live with Varroa alongside every other affected country on Earth. The consequences for Australian agriculture were immediate and severe. The almond industry, which depends on between 200,000 and 250,000 hives each season across Victoria and South Australia alone, was struck first and hardest. Hive rental rates that sat at $65 in 2019 had surged past $165 by 2023. When bee movement restrictions froze the supply chain, almond trees flowered on schedule, but with no pollinators to fertilize them, the blossoms fell without setting fruit. The damage rippled outward through every crop with pollination dependencies: apples, cherries, grapes, blueberries, watermelons. Economists warned that a 10% production reduction could drive food inflation up by 2 to 3 percentage points within a year, with price effects reaching consumers in the United States, Japan, and South Korea, all of which rely heavily on Australian agricultural exports. Small farms walked away from entire orchards. Large commercial operations spent tens of millions attempting emergency alternatives. Federal and state governments committed more than $200 million in emergency funding. The Department of Primary Industries acknowledged that even this figure understated the full damage. Honey industry revenues alone were projected to fall by no less than $48 million per year indefinitely. Australia's collapse as a clean bee supplier sent markets in Japan, South Korea, and the United States into immediate shortage and price instability. After more than a year of destroying hives to save the industry, Australia arrived at an unsettling truth. The strategy had accomplished the opposite of its intention. So, the entire approach was rebuilt from the ground up. The focus shifted from national containment to individual hive management. Beekeepers across the country were retrained, not to wait for government orders, but to monitor their own hives continuously, recognize infestation thresholds early, and apply targeted interventions before damage became irreversible. more than 190 apiaries joined a new pilot management network, connecting disease-free zones in the Australian Capital Territory with heavily affected regions in New South Wales. Schools and affected communities incorporated community hives into their teaching programs, not as a distraction, but as a direct lesson in how societies learn to adapt. Then, the bees surprised everyone. In apiaries throughout the affected zones, workers began documenting something unexpected. Bees were spontaneously grooming mites off one another with greater frequency and precision than previously observed. Others were detecting and removing larvae infected with Varroa before the mite could complete its reproductive cycle inside the sealed cell. Scientists identified this behavior as Varroa-sensitive hygiene, an instinctive resistance trait that certain bee populations had developed over generations of exposure elsewhere in the world. Queen bees from colonies displaying these characteristics were immediately selected for propagation, launching an accelerated breeding program aimed at establishing Varroa resistance as a standard trait in Australian commercial populations. The transformation extended to the farms themselves. Growers who had historically staked everything on managed honeybees began actively cultivating relationships with native bee species. All 1,700 of Australia's indigenous bee varieties are naturally immune to Varroa. Wildflower corridors were planted between orchards. Nesting habitats were established across farmland. Landscapes that had been stripped for monoculture production began recovering ecological diversity, becoming functional pollination networks rather than single-species dependencies. For managed honeybee colonies, integrated pest management became standard practice, rotating chemical treatments to stay ahead of resistance, removing infected brood comb to interrupt the mite's reproductive cycle, scheduling deliberate brood breaks to deny Varroa the sealed cells it needs to multiply. Technology became a central tool in the new strategy. Electronic biosensors deployed directly inside hive bodies began transmitting continuous data, temperature readings, humidity levels, mite density counts, to centralized monitoring systems. Artificial intelligence platforms and infrared imaging analyzed behavioral patterns in real time, detecting anomalies within hours of their emergence. In research laboratories, genomic analysis and CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tools accelerated the identification of natural resistance genes, collapsing timelines that would previously have required years of conventional selective breeding. Nanopore sequencing allowed researchers to track Varroa's genetic evolution at a granularity never before possible, providing early warning of emerging chemical resistances. What had been a scene of mass hive destruction in 2022 had become, just 2 years later, one of the most sophisticated integrated pest management systems on Earth, a collaboration between bees, farmers, researchers, and machines. By mid-2024, the early results justified cautious optimism. Across many apiaries in New South Wales, Varroa levels had been held below 5 mites per 100 adult bees, the threshold below which colonies can remain productive and stable. The 2024 almond pollination season, the annual stress test that demands more than 300,000 hives and leaves no margin for failure, concluded without the catastrophic shortfall the industry had feared. Hive rental prices remained elevated at $150 to $170 per unit, but supply held. Orchards were pollinated, fruit set, export commitments were met, global almond prices remained stable. Formal CSIRO analysis confirmed that the new sensor and monitoring network had reduced hive losses in the first half of 2024 by 20% compared to the same period the year before, with Varroa still fully present throughout. Urban apiaries in Sydney and Melbourne recorded unexpectedly strong colony performance, driven directly by the disease-resistant queen breeding programs. Varroa had not been defeated, but it had been managed. One beekeeper, asked to describe where things stood, said it plainly. "We stopped hoping for zero Varroa. The goal now is just to keep the bees healthy enough to get through the flowering season. In this year at least, we managed that." Not a complete victory,
but incontrovertible evidence that survival and recovery is possible. By July 2024, Varroa destructor had been transformed from an existential terror into a known and trackable adversary. Moving into 2025, Victoria and Queensland launched mobile applications allowing beekeepers to log mite counts, treatment histories, and colony health data from the field, feeding directly into a unified national database. The entire Australian beekeeping sector was no longer a collection of isolated operations. It had become a distributed, real-time early warning network capable of detecting regional surges before they metastasized into national crises. Australia's experience holds lessons that every agricultural nation on Earth needs to absorb. Monitor early. Real-time data infrastructure identifies outbreaks while
Containment is still possible. Reactive strategies consistently arrive too late. Diversify pollination systems. Native species provide biological insurance that no single pathogen can eliminate. Invest in genetic resistance. Chemical management is a temporary measure. Bees that can resist Varroa without human intervention are the only permanent solution. And build trust within the beekeeping community. Any response strategy that punishes transparency will be undermined from the inside. Beekeepers who fear losing everything will conceal infections. Early compensation, honest communication, and genuine support are not optional. They are the precondition for any coordinated response. Australia never asked to become the world's cautionary tale for biosecurity failure, but having been placed in that position, it chose to become something else instead. The world's most advanced example of what comes after failure: adaptation, innovation, and the refusal to surrender. Living with Varroa is not the death of an industry. As Australia is now demonstrating, it might be the moment when beekeeping finally grows up.